37 dauntless dive bombers screamed down through 14,000 feet of empty sky. Their target? 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steaming in formation, their flight decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft. The pilots have been searching for 2 hours. Fuel gauges read dangerously low. Some aircraft will not make it back to their carriers, but none of that matters now. Because spread out below them, vulnerable, exposed, unprepared, is the entire might of the Japanese carrier striking force that devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months ago. 3 American torpedo squadrons have already attacked. 41 torpedo bombers went in low and slow. 35 were shot down. 0 fighters slaughtered them. Not a single torpedo hit. The sacrifice seemed meaningless, wasteful, tragic. But those torpedo bombers drew every Japanese fighter down to wave-top level. They pulled the combat air patrol away from altitude. They left the sky above the carriers empty. Make sure you subscribe to our channel to discover more untold stories from history. And into that empty sky, the dive bombers fall. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey leads Enterprise's bombers. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie leads Yorktown's squadron. They dive at 70-degree angles, airspeed building toward terminal velocity. Anti-aircraft fire erupts from every ship. Shells burst around the diving aircraft. But dive bombers are hard to hit. They come too fast, too steep. At 10:22 a.m., the first 1,000-pound bomb strikes carrier Akagi. Then another hits Kaga. Then Soryu takes multiple hits. Within 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers are burning, their hangars filled with aviation fuel and armed bombs. Fires rage out of control. Secondary explosions rip through the ships. Japan's elite carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, is dying. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the tide of the Pacific War turns in 5 minutes. This is the Battle of Midway. This is how America came back from the edge of defeat and changed the course of World War II. This is that story. To understand Midway, we must start 6 months earlier, on a Sunday morning that changed everything. December 7th, 1941, Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. At 7:55 a.m., 183 Japanese aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, attacked the United States Pacific Fleet as it sat at anchor. A second wave of 170 aircraft followed. In 2 hours, Japan destroyed or damaged 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 188 aircraft. 2,400 Americans died. Another 1,178 were wounded. The attack was executed by the Kido Butai, Japan's first air fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled. They approached undetected, launched their aircraft, and achieved complete surprise. America was shocked, outraged, and terrified. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. The battleship, the symbol of naval power, had been proven vulnerable to air attack. Japan had demonstrated a new form of warfare, carrier-based aviation, striking hundreds of miles from the fleet itself, and America had no answer. But Pearl Harbor was not the total victory Japan believed. The American carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were not in port that day. They survived, and carriers, not battleships, would decide the Pacific War. In the 6 months following Pearl Harbor, Japan conquered with breathtaking speed. Hong Kong fell on December 25, 1941. Manila fell on January 6, 1942. Singapore, the British Empire's great fortress in Asia, surrendered on February 15th with 80,000 troops. The Dutch East Indies fell in March. Burma fell in May. Japan seized an empire. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, much of New Guinea, and island groups across the Central and Western Pacific. By May 1942, Japan controlled territory from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutian Islands south to the Dutch East Indies. It was the greatest territorial expansion in history, achieved in 5 months. The rising sun seemed unstoppable, but Japan had awakened a sleeping giant, and that giant, though wounded, though reeling, was beginning to fight back. On April 18, 1942, something impossible happened. 16 American B-25 bombers launched from the carrier USS Hornet and bombed Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya. The raids caused minimal physical damage, a few buildings destroyed, some fires started, 50 Japanese dead. But the psychological impact was enormous. Japan's home islands had been attacked. The sacred soil of the empire had been violated. The military had promised the emperor that Japan was safe from attack. That promise was a lie. The man responsible for defending Japan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. Yamamoto was Japan's most brilliant naval strategist. He had studied at Harvard. He understood America's industrial capacity. He had opposed war with the United States, warning that Japan could run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that, America's production would overwhelm Japan. Yamamoto had been proven right. He had given Japan 6 months. Pearl Harbor was December 7th. The Doolittle raid was April 18th, 4 months and 11 days later. Time was running out. Yamamoto understood Japan's strategic problem. Japan had conquered vast territories, but it had not destroyed the American Pacific Fleet. American carriers remained intact. American submarines were attacking Japanese shipping. American forces were regrouping. Unless Japan destroyed America's carrier fleet soon, the war would turn against Japan. Yamamoto devised a plan. Operation MI. The objective? Lure America's remaining carriers into a trap and destroy them. The bait. Midway Atoll. Midway is a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. 2 small islands, Sand Island and Eastern Island, surrounded by a coral reef. Total land area, 2.4 square miles. Population. In 1942, approximately 4,000 American military personnel. Midway is 300 miles northwest of Hawaii. It is almost exactly halfway between North America and Asia, hence the name. For Japan, Midway represented the next step in expanding their defensive perimeter. Capture Midway. And Japan could establish an advanced base for operations against Hawaii. More importantly, threatening Midway would force America to respond. The Pacific Fleet would sortie from Pearl Harbor to defend Midway. And when American carriers arrived, Yamamoto's trap would close. Yamamoto's plan was complex, arguably too complex. It involved multiple task forces approaching from different directions, coordinated timing, and simultaneous operations. The plan had 4 components. First, a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Japanese forces would strike Attu and Kiska, drawing American attention north. Second, a carrier striking force under Vice Admiral Nagumo would attack Midway with 4 fleet carriers, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Nagumo's carriers would destroy Midway's airfields and prepare for the invasion. Third, an invasion force carrying 5,000 troops would capture and occupy Midway. Fourth, Yamamoto himself, commanding from the super battleship Yamato, would position his main battle fleet 300 miles west of Midway. When American carriers arrived to defend Midway, Yamamoto's battleships and Nagumo's carriers would converge and destroy them. It was a brilliant plan. It should have worked, but it had a fatal flaw. Yamamoto assumed the Americans did not know it was coming. They knew. In a basement facility at Pearl Harbor, a small group of Navy cryptanalysts were performing miracles. Station Hypo was the code-breaking unit responsible for intercepting and decrypting Japanese naval communications. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, the team had been working since early 1942 to break the Japanese JN-25 naval code. By May 1942, they had made significant progress. They could not read everything, but they could read enough. And what they read indicated a major Japanese operation was coming. The intercepts referred to an objective designated AF. A large fleet would assemble. Multiple carriers would participate. The operation would occur in late May or early June. But where was AF? The intercepts did not say. Some intelligence analysts believed AF was the Aleutians. Others believed it was Fiji or Samoa. Rochefort believed it was Midway. To confirm his theory, Rochefort devised a brilliant deception. He had Midway send an uncoded radio message stating that the base's water distillation plant had broken down and fresh water was running short. If Japanese intelligence intercepted the message and reported it, the codebreakers would see if the intercepts mentioned AF having water problems. The plan worked. Within days, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was short of fresh water. Confirmation. AF was Midway. The target was identified. Further intercepts revealed more details. The date of the attack, June 4th or 5. The Japanese order of battle, 4 carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, invasion transports. The approach routes, the planned time of the initial airstrike. Rochefort's team had achieved what many considered impossible. They had given Admiral Chester Nimitz advance warning of Japan's plan. Now, Nimitz had to stop it. Chester William Nimitz was 57 years old when he assumed command of the Pacific Fleet on December 31st, 1941. He inherited a fleet crippled by Pearl Harbor, morale shattered, the enemy advancing on all fronts. Many officers believed the Pacific was lost. Nimitz did not. Nimitz was born in Fredericksburg, Texas in 1885. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1905. He was a submariner, a destroyer captain, a staff officer. He was calm, thoughtful, deliberate. He did not panic. He did not rage. He listened to his staff, considered options, and made decisions based on reason, not emotion. When Rochefort brought him the intelligence about Midway, Nimitz believed it. Many senior officers were skeptical. How could a handful of codebreakers read Japan's plans? But Nimitz trusted Rochefort. More importantly, Nimitz understood the strategic implications. If the intelligence was correct and Nimitz prepared, America could ambush the Japanese fleet. If the intelligence was wrong and Nimitz committed his carriers, he would lose them. It was the gamble of the war. Nimitz decided to risk everything. He had 3 carriers available: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Enterprise and Hornet were already in the Pacific under Rear Admiral William Halsey. Yorktown had been damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May and needed repairs. Navy engineers estimated 3 months to make her seaworthy. Nimitz gave them 3 days. Working around the clock, repair crews at Pearl Harbor performed miracles. Holes were patched, systems were jury-rigged. Damage that should have taken months was repaired enough for Yorktown to sail. On May 30th, 1942, Yorktown steamed out of Pearl Harbor. She was not fully repaired. She was held together by hope and welding, but she was combat capable, barely. Halsey should have commanded the carrier force, but he was hospitalized with severe dermatitis. Halsey recommended his cruiser commander, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, to replace him. Nimitz agreed. Spruance would command Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, senior to Spruance, would command Task Force 17 with Yorktown and exercise overall tactical command. Nimitz gave Fletcher and Spruance clear orders. You will be governed by the principle of calculated risk, which you will interpret to mean the avoidance of exposure of your force to attack by superior enemy forces without good prospect of inflicting, as a result of such exposure, greater damage to the enemy. Translation: fight smart. Do not throw your carriers away. But if you see an opening, take it. Nimitz was giving his commanders permission to use their judgment. He was not micromanaging. He trusted them. The American carriers would deploy to Point Luck, a rendezvous point 350 miles northeast of Midway, and wait. When the Japanese arrived, the Americans would ambush them. Simple in concept, extraordinarily risky in execution. Raymond Ames Spruance was 55 years old, a careful, methodical officer known for his intelligence and judgment. He had spent 3 tours at the Naval War College, where he studied strategy and tactics obsessively. He was not aggressive like Halsey. He was cautious, thoughtful, always calculating odds. Some considered him too cautious. But Spruance understood that carriers were irreplaceable. Lose them, and America lost the Pacific. Spruance had never commanded carriers before. He was a cruiser commander suddenly elevated to task force command. But Halsey trusted him. Nimitz trusted him. And Spruance would prove himself one of the greatest admirals in naval history. Frank Jack Fletcher was 56 years old, a more experienced carrier commander. He had commanded at Coral Sea, where American and Japanese carriers fought for the first time. Coral Sea was tactically a draw. Each side lost one carrier, but strategically an American victory because the Japanese invasion of Port Moresby was turned back. Fletcher was cautious, methodical, sometimes criticized for being overcautious, but at Midway, caution would serve him well. He would not throw his carriers away. He would wait for the right moment, and when that moment came, he would strike. Together, Spruance and Fletcher commanded approximately 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, 8 cruisers, 14 destroyers, approximately 233 carrier-based aircraft, 19 submarines. Against them, Japan was deploying 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 11 destroyers, approximately 248 carrier-based aircraft, plus Yamamoto's main force with the super battleship Yamato and multiple battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. On paper, Japan had the advantage. More carriers, more aircraft, more ships, more experience. But America had something Japan did not: knowledge of Japan's plan. And in warfare, knowledge is power. Chuichi Nagumo was 55 years old, a torpedo and destroyer specialist who never wanted to command carriers. But he commanded the Kido Butai, the carrier striking force, and had led it to victory after victory: Pearl Harbor, raids across the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, Ceylon. He had never lost. Nagumo was competent, but not visionary. He was cautious, sometimes indecisive. He followed orders, but did not innovate. His subordinates respected him, but did not revere him. He was a product of the Japanese system, a torpedo expert commanding carriers because the Imperial Navy's rigid promotion system did not value aviation specialists. Nagumo's 4 carriers at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were the same 4 that had struck Pearl Harbor. His pilots were veterans. His crews were experienced. He had never been defeated. Confidence bordering on arrogance permeated the fleet. The Americans had been beaten at Pearl Harbor. They had been beaten across the Pacific. They would be beaten again. But Nagumo had concerns. He knew American carriers remained operational. He knew they could appear anywhere. His reconnaissance was inadequate. His search planes were slow cruiser-launched float planes with limited range. But Yamamoto's plan assumed the Americans would not arrive until after Midway was attacked. Yamamoto assumed surprise. He was wrong. While the carriers maneuvered, Midway itself was being reinforced. If the atoll was to be bait, it had to survive long enough for the trap to spring. Navy, Marine, and Army Air Force units poured into Midway. By June 3, 1942, Midway's air strength included 28 Marine fighters, F-2A Buffalo and F-4F Wildcat, 27 Marine dive bombers, SBD Dauntless and SB-2U Vindicator, 6 Navy TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, brand new, just arrived, 4 Army B-26, Marauder bombers modified to carry torpedoes, 19 Army B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers, 32 PBY Catalina patrol seaplanes, approximately 115 aircraft in total. Most were obsolete or flown by inexperienced pilots. The Marine pilots had minimal training. Some had never fired their guns in combat. The B-17 crews had never attacked ships before, but they would fight anyway. Ground defenses were strengthened, anti-aircraft guns emplaced, machine gun positions dug. The 6th Marine Defense Battalion, 3,632 men, prepared to resist invasion. Every Marine understood that if the Japanese landed, Midway would become another Wake Island, a heroic but doomed last stand. By June 3, 1942, the trap was set. American carriers waited northeast of Midway. Midway's aircraft were armed and ready. Submarines patrolled approach routes. Everyone waited for the Japanese to arrive. They did not have to wait long. At 9:04 a.m. on June 3, 1942, a PBY Catalina flying long-range patrol spotted Japanese ships 500 miles west of Midway. The pilot reported sighting the main body of the Japanese fleet. In reality, he had found the invasion transport group, not Nagumo's carriers, which were approaching from the northwest. That afternoon, 9 B-17 Flying Fortresses attacked the transport group from high altitude. They dropped dozens of bombs. They claimed hits on battleships and transports. In reality, they hit nothing. High-altitude bombing of moving ships was extraordinarily difficult. The B-17s were a magnificent aircraft for bombing stationary targets, but against maneuvering ships, they were ineffective. That night, 4 PBY Catalinas conducted the first American night torpedo attack of the war. Flying at low altitude in darkness, they attacked Japanese ships with torpedoes. They claimed hits on a tanker. Whether they actually damaged anything is uncertain, but the attack proved American forces were willing to fight. Still, Nagumo's carrier force remained undetected. His 4 carriers were approaching from the northwest, steaming toward their launch point for the Midway strike. The Japanese had no idea American carriers were nearby. The trap remained unsprung. June 4th would be different. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, 1942, Vice Admiral Nagumo made his decision. At 4:30 a.m., his 4 carriers began launching the first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft lifted off into the darkness. 36 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N Kate level bombers, carrying bombs, not torpedoes, 36 Mitsubishi A-6M-0 fighters. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the strike. The aircraft formed up and headed southeast toward Midway, 240 miles away. They would arrive at dawn, bomb the airfields, destroy Midway's defenses, and prepare the way for invasion. But Nagumo kept half his strike force aboard his carriers, another 108 aircraft. These aircraft were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs designed to attack ships. They were the reserve strike, ready to launch if American ships appeared. Nagumo was being cautious. He had divided his strike package. It was prudent. It would prove disastrous. At 4:30 a.m., Nagumo also launched reconnaissance aircraft. 7 search planes, slow float planes catapulted from cruisers and battleships, fanned out to search sectors to the east and south, the directions from which American ships might approach. One of those search planes, launched from cruiser tone, was delayed 30 minutes due to catapult problems. 30 minutes. That delay would cost Japan the battle. As the strike aircraft headed toward Midway and the search planes spread out, Nagumo's carriers steamed southeast. He would close the distance to Midway, recover his strike aircraft, and prepare for further operations. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Then, at 5:34 a.m., a PBY Catalina transmitted a message that changed everything. Enemy carriers. At 5:34 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Howard 80, piloting a PBY Catalina on long-range patrol, spotted Japanese carriers through broken clouds. He transmitted, "Enemy carriers. Many enemy planes heading Midway bearing 320 degrees, distance 150. The message reached Midway. It reached Fletcher and Spruance aboard the American carriers. It reached Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. Everyone now knew. The Japanese carrier force had been located. The ambush could begin, but there was confusion. Where exactly were the carriers? The initial report gave a bearing and distance from Midway, but did not specify the carrier's exact position or course. Fletcher and Spruance needed precise coordinates to launch their strikes. At 6:03 a.m., another PBY transmitted. 2 carriers and battleships bearing 320 degrees, distance 180, course 135, speed 25. Better. Now, they had a course and speed. Fletcher and Spruance could plot the Japanese position, but they still needed more information. Were there more than 2 carriers? What was the exact composition of the force? While the Americans waited for more intelligence, Midway prepared to defend itself. At 6:16 a.m., radar on Midway detected incoming aircraft. The Japanese strike was minutes away. Midway's fighters scrambled to intercept. At 6:30 a.m., Tominaga's strike force reached Midway. The battle began. The 28 Marine fighters that scrambled from Midway were obsolete and outnumbered. 20 Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters, slow, poorly armed, nicknamed Flying Coffins, and 8 F-4F Wildcats went up to meet 108 Japanese aircraft. The Marine pilots were brave but inexperienced. Most had never seen combat. They flew their obsolete fighters against Zero fighters flown by Japanese veterans who had fought in China, at Pearl Harbor, across the Pacific. It was a massacre. The Zeros tore through the Marine formation. 15 of the 28 Marine fighters were shot down. Another 7 were damaged. The Marines claimed 16 Japanese aircraft destroyed, but actual Japanese losses were minimal, probably 3 to 5 aircraft. The survivors staggered back to Midway with horrific stories. Captain Philip White described the Zeros. They could turn inside us, outclimb us, outdive us. We couldn't touch them. Second Lieutenant Charles Hughes. It was murder. They were everywhere. While the fighters battled overhead, Japanese bombers attacked Midway itself. Bombs rained down on Sand Island and Eastern Island. The powerhouse was hit. Oil storage tanks erupted in flames. Buildings were destroyed. The mess hall was demolished. The hospital was struck. But the airfields survived. Damaged, but operational. And that was crucial. After 20 minutes of bombing, Tominaga surveyed the damage. Midway was burning, but it was not destroyed. The airfields were still usable. He radioed Nagumo. There is need for a second attack. That message would doom the Japanese fleet. Because while Tominaga was attacking Midway, Midway's bombers were attacking Nagumo. While Tominaga's bombers attacked Midway, every available aircraft on the atoll launched to attack Nagumo's carriers. They would strike before the Japanese could recover their aircraft and launch a second wave. First off were 6 brand new TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, part of Torpedo Squadron 8 that had been detached to Midway when Hornet sailed without them. These were the combat debut for both the Avenger aircraft and these particular pilots. None had ever dropped a torpedo in combat. Most had never even practiced with a live torpedo. Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling led them toward the Japanese fleet, following the bearing given by the PBY scouts. At 7:10 a.m., the Avengers found the Japanese carriers. Fieberling immediately attacked. The 6 TBFs came in low and slow. The only way to launch. Torpedoes. Zero fighters swarmed them instantly. The Avengers had no fighter escort. They were alone against the entire Japanese combat air patrol. 5 of the 6 Avengers were shot down within minutes. Fieberling was killed. Ensign Albert Ernest, flying the 6th Avenger, was hit repeatedly. His turret gunner killed, his radio man wounded, his hydraulics destroyed, his elevator controls shot away. But Ernest kept flying. He launched his torpedo. It missed, and somehow flew his shattered aircraft back to Midway, landing on one wheel with a dead engine. When ground crews examined his plane, they counted nearly 100 holes. It was a miracle he survived. 4 Army B-26 Marauders carrying torpedoes attacked next. They flew even lower than the Avengers, skimming wavetops at 200 feet. Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire shredded them. 2 B-26s were shot down. The other 2 were so badly damaged they barely made it back to Midway. Their torpedoes all missed. Then came the Marine dive bombers, 16 SBD Dauntless and 11 obsolete SB-2U Vindicator aircraft from Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241. Major Lofton Henderson led them. Henderson had never flown an SBD in combat. He led anyway. As his squadron dove on the carriers, zero fighters attacked. Henderson's plane was hit and exploded. He became the first Marine aviator killed at Midway. The airfield at Guadalcanal would later be named Henderson Field in his honor. The Marine bombers pressed their attacks with desperate courage. They dove through anti-aircraft fire, through zero fighters, through everything the Japanese threw at them. 8 Marine aircraft were shot down. The rest were damaged, and not a single bomb hit. Finally, 15 B-17 Flying Fortresses from the 431st Bombardment Squadron attacked from 20,000 feet. They dropped dozens of 500-pound bombs. The bombardiers were experienced. The bombing was accurate for high-altitude work, but hitting a maneuvering carrier from 20,000 feet was nearly impossible. The Japanese carriers twisted and turned. Every bomb missed. The B-17s flew back to Midway having inflicted no damage. By 8:30 a.m., Midway's counterattack was over. The Marines and Navy had lost. 5 of 6 TBF Avengers, 2 of 4 B-26 Marauders, 8 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 2 SB-2U Vindicators. Over 40% of Midway's strike aircraft were gone, and the Japanese carriers had not been touched. Not one bomb had hit. Not one torpedo had struck home. The sacrifice seemed meaningless. But those attacks had accomplished something crucial. They kept Nagumo's carriers busy. They prevented him from launching his reserve strike. They bought time, and time was what the American carriers needed. At 7:15 a.m., while Midway's aircraft were attacking his carriers, Vice Admiral Nagumo received Lieutenant Tomaniga's message, "There is need for a second attack on Midway." Nagumo faced a decision. He had 108 aircraft aboard his carriers armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, ready to attack American ships. But Tominaga said Midway needed another strike. Should Nagumo keep his reserve armed for ships, or should he rearm them with land attack bombs to finish off Midway? At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo had no confirmed reports of American ships in the area. His search planes had found nothing. He decided, rearm the reserve strike for a second attack on Midway. The order went out. Aboard Akagi and Kaga, ordnance crews began the laborious process of switching ordnance. Torpedoes were removed from aircraft and taken back to the magazines. Armor-piercing bombs were replaced with land attack bombs. It was exhausting, time-consuming work, but it had to be done. Then, at 7:28 a.m., everything changed. The search plane from cruiser tone, the one delayed 30 minutes at launch, finally reached its search sector. The pilot transmitted, "Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing out 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, course like 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. Enemy ships, 10 of them, steaming toward the battle area." Nagumo's blood must have run cold. American ships, a major force, only 240 miles away. Close enough to threaten his carriers. But were there carriers? The Tone Scout had not specified. Were these battleships, cruisers, or the American carriers Yamamoto had promised would not arrive until after Midway was secured? At 7:45 a.m., Nagumo radioed the Tone Scout. "Ascertain ship types and maintain contact." Silence. Minutes passed. Nagumo waited. His carriers continued maneuvering, evading attacks from Midway's aircraft. His ordnance crews continued rearming aircraft. Time ticked away. At 7:47 a.m., Nagumo made another decision, one that would haunt him. He ordered, "Prepare to carry out attacks on enemy fleet units. Leave torpedoes on those attack planes which have not as yet been changed to bombs." Too late. Most aircraft had already been rearmed with land attack bombs. Now Nagumo wanted torpedoes back on. The ordnance crews would have to reverse the entire process. Remove land attack bombs. Bring torpedoes back up from the magazines. Rearm the aircraft. It would take hours. At 8:09 a.m., the Tone Scout finally responded, "Enemy is composed of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. No carriers." Nagumo relaxed slightly. Cruisers and destroyers were dangerous, but they could not strike at his carriers from 200 miles away. Only carrier-based aircraft could do that. If the American force had no carriers, Nagumo had time. But at 8:20 a.m., the Tone Scout transmitted again. "The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier bringing up the rear. One carrier, maybe." "Appears to be" was not certain, but the possibility changed everything. If Americans had a carrier nearby, Nagumo's fleet was in immediate danger. He needed to launch a strike against that carrier before it could launch against him. But Nagumo could not launch immediately. His flight decks were cluttered. Tominaga's strike. Force was returning from Midway, low on fuel, some aircraft damaged. They needed to land immediately, or they would crash into the ocean. Nagumo had to recover his Midway strike before he could launch against the American carrier. At 8:37 a.m., Nagumo made his decision. Recover all aircraft from the Midway strike first, then spot the reserve strike on deck and launch against the American carrier. It was the textbook correct decision. Recover aircraft in the air before launching new strikes. Do not leave your pilots to ditch in the ocean. But it meant delay, and delay would be fatal. From 8:37 a.m. to 9:18 a.m., Nagumo's carriers recovered aircraft. Tominaga's strike force landed. Damaged aircraft were pushed aside. Crews refueled and rearmed returning aircraft. The flight decks became organized chaos. Aircraft everywhere. Fuel hoses running. Ordnance carts stacked with bombs and torpedoes. Below decks, the hangars were equally chaotic. Aircraft that had been rearmed with land attack bombs and then ordered switched back to torpedoes sat with ordnance scattered around them. Bombs that had been removed from aircraft sat on deck, still armed, ready to explode if hit. It was extraordinarily dangerous, but there was no time to stow everything properly. The Americans had carriers nearby. Nagumo needed to launch immediately. At 9:18 a.m., Nagumo finally reversed course, turning northeast to close the distance to the reported American carrier. At approximately 9:20 a.m., his carriers began spotting the strike aircraft on the flight decks for launch. 93 aircraft armed with torpedoes and dive bombs would attack the American carrier. Launch would begin around 10:30 a.m. Nagumo believed he had time. His strike would launch, hit the American carrier, and return victorious. The Japanese carriers would then finish off Midway. He had 15 minutes left to live. Aboard Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, the American commanders had been tracking the situation since the first PBY contact report at 5:34 a.m. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding from Yorktown, waited for more precise information before launching. He knew the Japanese were out there, but he needed better coordinates. Launching too early meant his aircraft might not find the enemy. Launching too late meant the Japanese might strike first. At 6:03 a.m., the second PBY report gave course and speed. Fletcher now had enough information. He ordered Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, to launch immediately while Fletcher held Yorktown's aircraft in reserve. Classic carrier doctrine. Hit the enemy with one force, hold the second in reserve to exploit success or respond to threats. But there was a problem. The Japanese carriers were 175 miles away, at the extreme range of American carrier aircraft. If the Americans launched immediately, their aircraft would barely have enough fuel to reach the target, attack, and return. Many would not make it back. They would ditch in the ocean or run out of fuel trying to find the carriers. It was a terrible gamble, but Spruance understood that this was the moment. The intelligence had given them this opportunity. If they waited for the Japanese to close, the Japanese might detect them and launch first, strike now, or risk losing the initiative. At 7:02 a.m., Enterprise began launching. At 7:06 a.m., Hornet began launching. 116 aircraft lifted off. From Enterprise. 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, bombing Squadron 6 and scouting Squadron 6. 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, Torpedo Squadron 6, 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. From Hornet. 35 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, bombing Squadron 8 and scouting Squadron 8. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, Torpedo Squadron 8. 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters. The launch took over an hour. By 8:06 a.m., the last aircraft was airborne. They formed up and headed southwest toward the reported enemy position, 155 miles away. The strike was launched. There was no recall. They would find the Japanese carriers or die trying. Fletcher held Yorktown's aircraft until 8:38 a.m., waiting to see if more Japanese carriers were detected. When no additional carriers appeared, he launched from Brisk Harbor. Yorktown. 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, bombing Squadron 3, 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, Torpedo Squadron 3, 6 F-4F Wildcat fighters. The American strike package was away. 151 carrier aircraft, everything the three carriers could launch, were flying toward the Japanese fleet. It was the largest carrier strike in American history to that date. Success would turn the tide of the war. Failure would doom the Pacific Fleet. The American strike groups flew southwest. They were supposed to find 4 Japanese carriers steaming southeast. But when they arrived at the expected intercept point, the ocean was empty. The Japanese had changed course. At 9:18 a.m., after the American aircraft had already launched, Nagumo had reversed course to northeast, closing the distance toward the American carriers. That course change meant the American aircraft were flying to where the Japanese had been, not where they were now. The Hornet strike group, led by Commander Stanhope Ring, maintained the original southwest heading. Ring was convinced the Japanese would continue toward Midway. He led his 35 dive bombers, 15 torpedo bombers, and 10 fighters on that heading. They flew and flew. They found nothing. The ocean remained empty. At approximately 9:20 a.m., Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, broke radio silence. He told Ring he believed the Japanese had changed course and were to the north. Ring ignored him. Waldron made the decision to disobey orders. He turned his 15 torpedo bombers north, separating from the rest of Hornet's strike group. Ring continued southwest with the dive bombers and fighters. They searched until their fuel was critical. Ring finally turned back toward Hornet. The dive bombers made it back. The fighters ran out of fuel and ditched. The pilots were rescued, but Ring's entire strike group, 59 aircraft, had missed the battle entirely. Meanwhile, Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 flew north. At 9:20 a.m., they spotted smoke on the horizon. Waldron led his squadron toward it. At 9:25 a.m., they saw the Japanese carriers, all 4 of them, steaming in formation, surrounded by cruisers and destroyers. Waldron had found them. Now he had to attack. Alone. With no dive bomber support, no fighter cover. 15 obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers against the entire Japanese fleet. Waldron transmitted, "We will go in. We won't turn back. We will attack." Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron was 41 years old, part Sioux, born in South Dakota. He was a passionate, aggressive officer who trained his men relentlessly. He had told them before the battle, "If only one plane survives, I want that plane to go in and get a hit." Now he was leading his squadron into an attack he knew was suicide. The TBD Devastator was obsolete in 1942. It was slow, top speed 115 mph with a torpedo. It had to fly low and straight to drop a torpedo, perfect target for fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The Devastator's only advantages were the courage of its crews and the slim hope that a torpedo hit would cripple a carrier. At 9:25 a.m., Torpedo Squadron 8 began its attack run. The 15 Devastators came in at wave-top altitude, 100 feet above the ocean, aiming for carrier Kaga. Every ship in the Japanese fleet opened fire. Tracers filled the sky. Shells exploded around the lumbering torpedo bombers. Then the Zeros arrived. Japanese fighter pilots dove on the Devastators like hawks on mice. The Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, better armed. The Devastators could not escape, could not evade. They could only fly straight and hope. Zero after Zero made firing runs. Machine gun bullets tore through fabric and metal. The Devastators began falling. Ensign George Gay, flying the last aircraft in the formation, watched his squadron mates die one by one. Aircraft exploded in the flames. Others cartwheeled into the ocean. Within 6 minutes, 14 of the 15 Devastators were shot down. Pilots and radio men died in their cockpits or drowned in the ocean. Gay's aircraft was the last one left. He pressed his attack, flying directly at carrier Soryu. He launched his torpedo at point-blank range. It missed. Immediately, 5 Zeros jumped him. His radio man, Robert Huntington, fired back until he was killed. Gay's plane was hit repeatedly. The engine seized. The aircraft plunged toward the ocean. Gay's Devastator smashed into the water. Gay was thrown clear. He surfaced, wounded, alone. His radio man was dead. His aircraft was sinking. Around him, the ocean was littered with debris and bodies, all that remained of Torpedo Squadron 8. Ensign George Gay was the only survivor. 30 men had flown in the attack. 29 were dead. Gay hid under a floating seat cushion for the next 30 hours, watching the battle unfold around him, praying he would not be spotted by Japanese ships. Torpedo Squadron 8 had scored no hits. They had sacrificed themselves for nothing. Or had they? At 9:40 a.m., Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 arrived over the Japanese fleet. 14 Devastators led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. They had become separated from Enterprise's dive bombers during the flight. They attacked alone, just like Torpedo Squadron 8. The Japanese were ready. Zeros swarmed the Devastators. Anti-aircraft fire intensified. Lindsay's squadron pressed the attack with the same courage Waldron's men had shown. 10 of the 14 Devastators were shot down. Lindsay was killed. The surviving 4 aircraft staggered back toward Enterprise, all badly damaged. No torpedo hits. At 10:00 a.m., Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 arrived. 12 Devastators led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. Unlike the previous attacks, VT-3 had fighter escort. 6 F-4F Wildcats led by Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch. Thatch's fighters engaged the Zeros, trying to protect the torpedo bombers. The Wildcats shot down several Zeros, but there were too many. The Zeros broke through and slaughtered the Devastators. 10 of 12 were shot down. Massey was killed. Only 2 aircraft survived. Again, no torpedo hits. In less than 40 minutes, 3 American torpedo squadrons, 41 aircraft carrying torpedoes, had attacked the Japanese carriers. 35 were shot down. Only 6 survived, all damaged. Not a single torpedo hit. The sacrifice was staggering. The torpedo pilots had died for nothing, or so it seemed, because those torpedo attacks had pulled every Japanese Zero fighter down to wave-top level. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, 30 to 40 fighters, were all at low altitude, slaughtering torpedo bombers. The sky above 10,000 feet was empty, and into that empty sky came the dive bombers. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, commanding Enterprise's dive bomber group, had been searching for over 2 hours. He had led 33 dauntless dive bombers on the original southwest heading. When they reached the expected intercept point and found nothing, McCluskey had to decide: return to Enterprise with full bomb loads, or continue searching until they found the Japanese or ran out of fuel. McCluskey chose to search. He turned his formation northwest, then northeast, paralleling the course he thought the Japanese might have taken. Fuel gauges dropped toward empty. Some aircraft would not make it back, but McCluskey kept searching. At 10:05 a.m., McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer, Arashi, racing northeast at high speed. Arashi had been dropping depth charges on an American submarine and was now racing to rejoin the fleet. McCluskey followed her wake. At 10:20 a.m., he saw them, 4 Japanese carriers in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft. McCluskey had found the entire Kido Butai, and he had arrived at the perfect moment. The Japanese carriers had just finished recovering aircraft. They had spotted their strike aircraft on the decks, preparing to launch. Zeros had just been pulled down to wave-top level by the torpedo attacks. Anti-aircraft gunners were focused on low-level threats. No one was looking up. McCluskey split his force. 17 dive bombers from Bombing Squadron 6 would hit Kaga. 16 dive bombers from Scouting Squadron 6 would hit Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey pushed over into his dive. 33 dauntless dive bombers followed him down, screaming through 14,000 feet in steep 70-degree dives. The Japanese carriers were perfect targets, steaming on steady courses, decks packed with fully fueled and armed aircraft, ready to explode at the slightest spark. The first 1,000-pound bomb struck carrier Kaga amidships. The explosion ripped through the flight deck into the hangar below. Aircraft caught fire. Aviation fuel ignited. Secondary explosions began. Another bomb hit Kaga near the island, then another near the bow. Within 60 seconds, Kaga was burning out of control, fires raging through her hangars. Akagi was hit near the amidships elevator. The bomb penetrated the flight deck, exploded in the hangar, and ignited aircraft and ordnance stored there. A second near miss ruptured fuel lines. Fire spread instantly. Within minutes, Akagi's flight deck was an inferno. At almost the same instant, Yorktown's dive bombers arrived. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 Dauntlesses from Bombing Squadron 3. Leslie had lost his bomb due to an electrical malfunction, but his squadron pressed the attack. They dove on carrier Soryu. 3 1,000-pound bombs hit within 60 seconds. The first struck near the forward elevator, penetrating into the hangar. The second hit amidships. The third struck aft. Soryu exploded in flames. Her captain, realizing his ship was doomed, ordered abandon ship within 20 minutes. From 10:22 a.m. to 10:27 a.m., 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were fatally damaged. The carriers that struck Pearl Harbor, the carriers that had ranged across the Pacific undefeated, burning, exploding, dying. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu would all sink within the next 24 hours. But functionally, they were dead at 10:27 a.m. Their hangars were infernos. Their flight decks were unusable. Their crews were abandoning ship. Japan's carrier striking force had been shattered in 5 minutes. It was the most decisive 5 minutes in naval history. Vice Admiral Nagumo had transferred his flag from the burning Akagi to light cruiser Nagara. From Nagara's bridge, he watched 3 of his 4 carriers burning. He was in shock. How had this happened? Where had the American dive bombers come from? How had they penetrated undetected? But one carrier remained. Hiryu, Carrier Division 2. Under Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi had been steaming several miles north of the other three carriers. When the dive bombers struck Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, Hiryu was untouched. Yamaguchi immediately launched a counterstrike. At 10:54 a.m., 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters took off from Hiryu. They flew east, searching for the American carriers. At 11:59 a.m., Hiryu's strike located Yorktown. The dive bombers attacked immediately. Yorktown's combat air patrol, Wildcat fighters, engaged the Vals, shooting down most of them. But 7 Vals broke through the fighter screen and dove on Yorktown. 3 bombs hit. The first struck near the island, penetrating deep into the ship before exploding. The blast destroyed boilers. Yorktown's speed dropped to 6 knots. The second bomb exploded in the smoke uptakes, knocking out more boilers. The third bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, starting fires. Yorktown was hurt, but not dead. Damage control teams fought the fires. Engineers worked miracles to restore power. Within an hour, Yorktown was making 20 knots and recovering aircraft. Her crew had saved the ship, but Hiryu was not done. At 1 p.m., Hiryu launched a second strike. 10 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros. These were the last operational attack aircraft on Hiryu. If they failed, Hiryu would be defenseless. At 2:30 p.m., the torpedo bombers found Yorktown. The Kates came in low, launching torpedoes from multiple directions. Yorktown's gunners shot down several, but 4 torpedoes struck home, 2 on the port side. The explosions tore enormous holes below the waterline. Yorktown listed 17 degrees. Power failed. The ship was dead in the water. At 3 p.m., Yorktown's captain, Elliot Buckmaster, gave the order to abandon ship. The crew went over the side. Destroyers rescued survivors. Yorktown remained afloat, listing heavily, but still floating. Hiryu had evened the score, 3 Japanese carriers burning, 1 American carrier abandoned. But the battle was not over. At 2:45 p.m., while Hiryu's second strike was attacking Yorktown, a PBY Catalina scout plane located Hiryu steaming north, approximately 110 miles from the American carriers. At 3:30 p.m., Enterprise, the only operational American carrier with serviceable aircraft, launched a strike. 24 Dauntless dive bombers, including some refugees from Yorktown whose carrier was sinking. At 5 p.m., the dive bombers found Hiryu. The Japanese carrier had no fighter cover. All her Zeros had been lost attacking Yorktown or defending the other carriers. Hiryu was naked, vulnerable. 24 dive bombers attacked. 4 bombs hit. The first struck near the forward elevator. The second hit amidships, penetrating the flight deck into the hangar. The third and fourth bombs struck aft. Hiryu's flight deck erupted in flames. Just like Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, Hiryu burned out of control. Fires consumed her hangars. Explosions ripped through her hull. By 9 p.m., Rear Admiral Yamaguchi realized his ship was doomed. Yamaguchi and Hiryu's captain, Tomeo Kaku, chose to go down with their ship. Rather than be rescued, they remained aboard the burning carrier. At 5:10 a.m. on June 5, 1942, torpedoes from Japanese destroyers scuttled Hiryu. She sank with Yamaguchi and Kaku still aboard. All 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were gone. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu all sunk within 24 hours. Japan's carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, had been annihilated. 300 miles west of the burning carriers, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto commanded from the bridge of super battleship Yamato. Reports of the disaster trickled in throughout the afternoon. 3 carriers lost, now 4 carriers lost. The American carriers still operational. The Midway operation was in ruins. Yamamoto considered his options. He still had overwhelming surface superiority, battleships, cruisers, destroyers. He could charge east and engage the American carriers in a night surface battle. Japanese ships excelled at night combat. If he could close the distance, his battleships could destroy the American carriers with gunfire. But the Americans had withdrawn to the east, refusing to close. Rear Admiral Spruance, now commanding the American carrier force after Fletcher's flagship was hit, understood the danger. He would not let Japanese surface ships close. He maintained distance, refusing to be drawn into a night engagement. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, Yamamoto made his decision. He ordered, "Occupation of Midway is cancelled." The fleet would withdraw. The operation had failed. It was the first Japanese retreat of the war, the first time a Japanese naval operation had been abandoned due to enemy action. The psychological impact was enormous. Japanese sailors who had never known defeat now understood. They could lose. Yamamoto's fleet turned west and headed back toward Japan. They would arrive home in defeat, having lost 4 irreplaceable carriers and many of their most experienced pilots. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. On June 5th, American forces pursued the retreating Japanese fleet. Spruance was cautious. He would not risk his carriers in a night surface engagement, but he sent aircraft to harry the retreating Japanese forces. At 8 a.m. on June 5th, dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet attacked a group of Japanese cruisers. Heavy cruiser Mikuma and heavy cruiser Mogami had collided during a night maneuver and were steaming slowly, damaged. The dive bombers sank Mikuma and further damaged Mogami. It was small consolation for the loss of Yorktown, but it was something. On June 6th, a Japanese submarine, I-168, found Yorktown still floating, held afloat by her buoyancy despite the torpedoes and bombs. Destroyer Hammann was alongside, providing power and damage control support. I-168 fired 4 torpedoes. 2 hit Yorktown. 1 hit Hammann, breaking her in half. Hammann sank in minutes with heavy casualties. Yorktown remained afloat. On June 7th, Yorktown finally succumbed. The old carrier, veteran of Coral Sea, rushed back into service for Midway, hit by 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes, rolled over, and sank. She went down at 5:00 a.m., taking the lives of 141 men who had died during the battle. The Battle of Midway was over. The Battle of Midway was over. The guns fell silent. The fires burned out. The ocean claimed the dead. Now came the accounting, the terrible arithmetic of war. American losses, USS Yorktown, CV-5, sunk. The carrier that had been rushed back into service, that had survived Coral Sea only to be repaired in 3 days instead of 3 months, was gone. 141 men died with her. USS Hammann, DD-412, sunk by submarine I-168 while assisting Yorktown. 80 men killed when she broke in half. Aircraft, 147 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair. 98 carrier aircraft, 49 land-based aircraft from Midway. Personnel, 307 killed. This number included Torpedo Squadron 8, 29 of 30 dead. Torpedo Squadron 6, 10 of 14 dead. Torpedo. Squadron 3, 10 of 12 dead. Dive bomber crews, fighter pilots, Midway-based air crew, Yorktown's crew, Hammond's crew. 307 American servicemen gave their lives at Midway. Each one was someone's son, brother, husband, father. Each one left families who would never see them again. Japanese losses, 4 fleet carriers, all sunk. Akagi, 267 dead. Kaga, 801 dead. Soryu, 711 dead. Hiryu, 392 dead. Heavy cruiser, Mikuma, sunk. 700 dead aircraft. 248 carrier aircraft destroyed. This was every aircraft on the 4 carriers. Additionally, dozens of land-based aircraft from the Aleutians operation were lost. Personnel, approximately 3,057 killed. This included over 2,000 sailors who went down with the carriers, pilots and air crew, cruiser crews, some of Japan's most experienced carrier pilots. But the numbers alone do not tell the story. Japan lost something irreplaceable at Midway, the core of its naval aviation expertise. The pilots who died at Midway were veterans, men who had fought in China, at Pearl Harbor, across the Pacific. They were the elite, the best-trained naval aviators in the world. Japan could build new carriers, eventually, but it could not replace these pilots. Training took years. Experience came only from combat. The pilots who died at Midway represented a decade of training and experience. They were irreplaceable. Japan also lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. These were not small escort carriers or converted merchantmen. These were purpose-built fleet carriers, fast, heavily armed, capable of projecting power across thousands of miles. Japan's industrial capacity could not replace them quickly. It would take years to build new carriers. the war would not wait years. America lost one carrier, Yorktown, but America had more. Carriers under construction. Enterprise and Hornet survived. Saratoga was in the Atlantic. Wasp would soon arrive. And in American shipyards, the Essex-class fleet carriers were being built. Fast, modern, capable. The first would enter service in 1943. Eventually, America would build over 100 carriers of all types. Japan would never match that production. The mathematics of industrial warfare were brutal and simple. America could replace losses. Japan could not. Behind the statistics were individual human beings, men who fought, suffered, and died. Their stories deserve to be told. Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron. Commander of Torpedo Squadron 8, led his 15 torpedo bombers to certain death because it was his duty. Before the battle, he had written a letter to his wife. "If I don't come back, you'll know that I went down fighting and did my best." He kept that promise. His body was never recovered. He was 41 years old. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent 30 hours floating in the ocean, hiding under a seat cushion, watching the battle rage around him. He was rescued on June 5th by a PBY Catalina. He spent weeks in the hospital recovering from wounds and exposure. He was promoted, awarded the Navy Cross, and became an instant celebrity. But Gay never forgot his squadron mates. For the rest of his life, he spoke about Torpedo Squadron 8, ensuring their sacrifice was remembered. He died in 1994 at age 77. His ashes were scattered at the coordinates where Torpedo Squadron 8 attacked, a final return to his fallen brothers. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, who led Enterprise's dive bombers, made the decision to continue searching when the Japanese were not where expected. That decision, risking fuel exhaustion, risking losing aircraft, led directly to finding the Japanese carriers at the perfect moment. McCluskey was wounded during the battle, shot in the shoulder by anti-aircraft fire, but flew back to Enterprise and landed safely. He was awarded the Navy Cross and later the Distinguished Flying Cross. He survived the war, retired as a Rear Admiral, and died in 1976 at age 76. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, who led Yorktown's dive bombers, lost his bomb due to an electrical malfunction, but led his squadron anyway. His squadron put 3 bombs into Soryu, sinking her. Leslie survived the battle, continued flying combat missions, and survived the war. He retired as a Rear Admiral and died in 1985 at age 75. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, commander of Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6, led 14 Devastators into the attack, knowing the odds were suicide. 10 of his aircraft were shot down. Lindsay was killed. He was 38 years old. His body was never recovered. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, commander of Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3, led 12 Devastators into battle. 10 were shot down. Massey was killed. He was 33 years old. His body was never recovered. Captain Elliot Buckmaster, commanding officer of USS Yorktown, fought to save his ship after she was bombed and torpedoed. When further damage made her unsalvageable, he ordered abandoned ship, ensuring his crew was rescued. He watched from a destroyer as his ship, the ship he had commanded for less than a year, sank beneath the waves. Buckmaster survived the war, retired as a Rear Admiral, and died in 1976 at age 81. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 of the Kido Butai, was considered one of Japan's finest naval officers. Aggressive, intelligent, innovative. Some believed he was being groomed to succeed Yamamoto. When Hiryu was fatally damaged, Yamaguchi chose to go down with his ship rather than be rescued. He and Hiryu's captain, Tomeo Kaku, remained aboard as Hiryu sank on the morning of June 5th. Yamaguchi was 52 years old. His death was a tremendous loss for the Imperial Japanese Navy. These were just a few of the thousands who fought at Midway. Each one deserves to be remembered. Military historians debate which battle was the turning point of the Pacific War. Some argue for the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, where American carriers stopped a Japanese invasion for the first time. Others point to Guadalcanal, where American forces went on the offensive, but most historians agree. Midway was the turning point. Here is why. First, the strategic initiative permanently shifted to America. Before Midway, Japan was on the offensive. After Pearl Harbor, Japan conquered half the Pacific in 6 months. They chose where to attack. They chose when to attack. America reacted defensively, trying to stop Japanese advances. After Midway, Japan never launched another major offensive operation in the Pacific. The rest of the war, from June 1942 to August 1945, was Japan defending territory while America attacked. The strategic initiative passed to the United States and never returned. Second, Japan's carrier striking force was permanently crippled. The Kido Butai, the 6 carriers that struck Pearl Harbor, was the world's most powerful naval aviation force. After Midway, 4 of those carriers were gone. Japan had 2 fleet carriers left, Shokaku and Zuikaku, both damaged at Coral Sea and not at Midway. Japan would build more carriers, but it would take years, and Japan could not replace the experienced pilots lost at Midway. America, meanwhile, was building carriers at an astonishing rate. By 1943, Essex-class fleet carriers were entering service, faster, more heavily armed, and more capable than Japan's pre-war carriers. By 1945, America would have over 100 carriers of all types. Japan would never achieve carrier parity again. Third, Japanese naval doctrine was proven flawed. Japan's pre-war doctrine emphasized the decisive battle, one great fleet engagement that would destroy the enemy and win the war. Midway was supposed to be that decisive battle. Instead, it exposed the flaws in Japanese planning: overcomplexity, divided forces, inadequate reconnaissance, and inflexible command structures. After Midway, Japan's admirals understood their doctrine was wrong, but changing doctrine in the middle of a war is extraordinarily difficult. Japan never fully adapted. American doctrine, emphasizing flexibility, decentralized command, and overwhelming force, proved superior. Fourth, Japanese morale was shattered. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan had been invincible. Every operation succeeded. Every enemy was defeated. Japanese sailors and pilots believed they were unstoppable. Midway shattered that belief. Japanese forces had been defeated, badly defeated. 4 carriers sunk in a single day, thousands dead, the fleet retreating. It was psychologically devastating. Japanese morale never fully recovered. American morale, conversely, soared. After 6 months of defeat and retreat, America had won a great victory. The Japanese could be beaten. The war was winnable. That psychological shift was as important as the material losses. Fifth, the balance of industrial power became obvious. Midway demonstrated that the Pacific War would be won by industrial capacity, not just tactical brilliance. Japan sank 1 American carrier. America would replace it with 10. Japan lost 248 aircraft. America would build 10,000 more. Japan lost irreplaceable pilots. America's training programs would produce thousands of aviators. Admiral Yamamoto had predicted this. He said Japan could run wild for 6 months, then American industrial power would overwhelm Japan. Midway occurred 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto was exactly right. The Japanese government and military went to extraordinary lengths to hide the magnitude of the Midway defeat from the Japanese people. Wounded sailors from the sunken carriers were isolated in hospitals, forbidden to speak about what happened. Officers who survived were ordered never to discuss the battle. Families of the dead were told their loved ones had died heroically, but were given no details. The Japanese press reported Midway as a victory. Newspapers claimed American carriers had been sunk and Midway captured. The truth, that Japan had lost 4 carriers, was classified at the highest levels. Only Emperor Hirohito and the senior naval staff knew the full extent of the disaster. This secrecy had consequences. Japan's civilian leadership did not understand how badly the war was going. They believed Japan was winning. They approved continued offensive operations, not knowing Japan's carrier force was crippled. The lies prevented Japan from making rational strategic decisions. Even within the military, the culture of secrecy meant junior officers did not understand the strategic situation. They continued fighting, believing victory was possible, not knowing Japan had already lost the war. The truth about Midway did not become widely known in Japan until after the war ended in 1945. When the Japanese people learned what had really happened, the shock was profound. Their government had lied to them for 3 years. The victory they had celebrated was actually a devastating defeat. In America, the Battle of Midway was celebrated as a great victory. President Franklin Roosevelt personally congratulated Admiral Nimitz and the Pacific Fleet. Newspapers ran headlines, "Japs lose 4 carriers at Midway." The victory was a propaganda bonanza, boosting civilian morale at a crucial moment. But there was debate about how the victory was achieved. Was it luck? Was it skill? Was it superior intelligence? The truth, as always, was complex. Intelligence was crucial. Without the codebreakers at Station Hypo, America would not have known Japan was attacking Midway. The ambush would have been impossible. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team gave Admiral Nimitz the most valuable asset in warfare: knowledge of enemy plans. Rochefort was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal and later promoted. His team's work remained classified for decades, but eventually received the recognition it deserved. Luck played a role. Wade McCluskey's dive bombers arrived at the perfect moment, after the torpedo squadrons had pulled Japanese fighters down to wave level, leaving the sky above clear. That timing was partially luck. If McCluskey had arrived 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, the battle might have turned out differently. The delayed search plane from cruiser tone meant Japan's scouting was inadequate. That 30-minute delay meant Nagumo did not know American carriers were nearby until too late. That was bad luck for Japan, good luck for America. But skill mattered most. Nimitz's decision to trust his intelligence and risk everything was brilliant strategic thinking. Spruance's decision to launch at extreme range, risking aircraft running out of fuel, was bold and correct. McCluskey's decision to continue searching when the Japanese were not where expected showed initiative and tactical judgment. The Torpedo Squadron pilots who attacked knowing they would likely die showed extraordinary courage. The dive bomber pilots who pressed attacks through anti-aircraft fire demonstrated skill and determination. American victory at Midway was not luck. It was the result of good intelligence, bold decisions, tactical skill, and the courage of men who refused to quit. For Japan, Midway was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological catastrophe that exposed the fundamental weaknesses in Japanese strategy. Admiral Yamamoto understood immediately. He had warned that Japan could not win a long war against American industrial power. Midway proved him right. The 6 months he had given Japan were over. Now, America would bring its full industrial might to bear. Yamamoto wanted to resign after Midway. He believed he had failed. The Japanese government refused his resignation. They needed Yamamoto. He was Japan's most capable admiral, but Yamamoto was a changed man after Midway. He became more cautious, more defensive. The aggressive spirit that drove Pearl Harbor was gone. Yamamoto would not survive the war. On April 18, 1943, 1 year to the day after the Doolittle raid that prompted the Midway operation, American P-38 fighters intercepted Yamamoto's transport aircraft over Bougainville and shot it down. Yamamoto was killed. Some historians believe Yamamoto deliberately flew into danger, choosing an honorable death in combat over watching Japan's inevitable defeat. For ordinary Japanese sailors and pilots, Midway was the moment they understood they could lose. Many continued fighting with fanatical determination, but the certainty of victory was gone. From Midway forward, Japanese forces fought knowing defeat was possible, even probable. The Japanese Navy never recovered from Midway. It fought major battles, the Philippine Sea in 1944, Leyte Gulf in 1944, but it never again achieved the dominance it held in early 1942. The carriers lost at Midway were never adequately replaced. The pilots lost at Midway could not be replaced at all. Midway did not end the war. It changed the trajectory of the war. But 2 more years of brutal fighting remained in the Pacific. In August 1942, 2 months after Midway, American forces invaded Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The battle for Guadalcanal lasted 6 months. American Marines landed on August 7th and fought in the jungle for control of Henderson Field, the airstrip named after the Marine pilot killed at Midway. At Guadalcanal, America proved it could not only stop Japanese advances, but could take back territory. The battle was savage, close-quarters jungle fighting, naval engagements, air battles. Both sides suffered heavy casualties. But America won. Guadalcanal was the first major American offensive victory of the Pacific War. After Guadalcanal came the island-hopping campaign, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island was paid for in blood. Each brought American forces closer to Japan. The strategy was brutal but effective. Bypass heavily defended islands, capture strategic positions, establish airfields, and move closer to the Japanese home islands. Throughout this campaign, American carriers dominated. The Essex-class fleet carriers, built after Midway, formed the backbone of the fast carrier task forces that roamed the Pacific, striking Japanese positions with impunity. Japan could not contest American carrier supremacy. The carriers lost at Midway were never replaced. In June 1944, exactly 2 years after Midway, the Battle of the Philippine Sea occurred. American carriers faced the reconstituted Japanese carrier fleet. The result was called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American pilots shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft in one day, destroying Japan's naval aviation once and for all. It was Midway repeated on a larger scale, another crushing carrier defeat that Japan could not recover from. In October 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf saw the Imperial Japanese Navy's last major fleet engagement. The Japanese lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The road from Midway to Tokyo took 3 more years. 3 years of battles, 3 years of sacrifices. Millions more would die before the war ended in August 1945 with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But Midway was the moment when the outcome became inevitable. Japan could still fight, but it could no longer win. Today, over 80 years after the Battle of Midway, the battle is remembered as one of the most significant naval engagements in history. It is taught at military academies worldwide. It is studied by historians and strategists. It is commemorated every June 4 by the United States Navy. Midway Atoll itself is now a national wildlife refuge. The airfields are abandoned. The fortifications are ruins. Nature has reclaimed the islands. But the memory remains. In 1942, immediately after the battle, the Navy produced a documentary directed by John Ford, the famous Hollywood director who happened to be on Midway during the attack and filmed the Japanese bombing. Ford's documentary, simply titled The Battle of Midway, won the Academy Award for Best Documentary. It brought the battle to American audiences and helped build support for the war effort. In 1976, the movie Midway, starring Charlton Heston, Henry Fonda, and James Coburn, introduced a new generation to the battle. The film used actual combat footage mixed with dramatic recreations. While not entirely historically accurate, it popularized the story. In 2019, director Roland Emmerich released another film called Midway, attempting a more historically accurate depiction of the battle. The film focused on the dive bomber pilots and the intelligence officers who broke the Japanese codes. But beyond movies and documentaries, Midway's legacy lives in the lessons it teaches. First, intelligence wins wars. The codebreakers at Station Hypo gave America the advantage that made victory possible. In modern warfare, information is as important as firepower. Second, bold decisions matter. Nimitz's decision to risk everything based on intelligence, Spruance's decision to launch at extreme range, McCluskey's decision to keep searching. These bold decisions turned potential defeat into victory. Third, courage under impossible odds. The Torpedo Squadron pilots who attacked knowing they would probably die, the dive bomber pilots who pressed attacks through anti-aircraft fire, the sailors who fought to save damaged ships, their courage made victory possible. Fourth, industrial power wins wars. Japan won tactical victories but could not match American industrial. A production, the side that can replace losses, build more ships, train more pilots, produce more aircraft, that side wins. Fifth, flexibility defeats rigidity. American commanders adapted to circumstances. Japanese commanders followed rigid plans. When plans failed, American forces improvised. Japanese forces did not. That flexibility was decisive. In the decades after Midway, the survivors aged. The young pilots who fought in 1942 became grandfathers. The sailors who manned the carriers retired, raised families, lived quiet lives. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent 30 years as a commercial airline pilot after the war. He spoke frequently about Midway, ensuring his squadron mates were remembered. He wrote a book, Sole Survivor, detailing his experience. He attended reunions, met with veterans, visited schools. He kept the memory alive. When he died in 1994, his ashes were scattered at the location where Torpedo Squadron 8 attacked, a final reunion with his fallen brothers. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who commanded at Midway and later commanded the Fifth Fleet in major operations across the Pacific, retired after the war. He served as president of the Naval War College, then as ambassador to the Philippines. He was quiet, modest, and rarely spoke about his achievements. He died in 1969 at age 83. He is buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in California. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor through Japan's surrender, became a national hero. After the war, he served as Chief of Naval Operations. He died in 1966 at age 80. He is buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery near his wartime subordinate Spruance. On his tombstone is a simple inscription, Fleet Admiral, United States Navy. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who commanded at both Coral Sea and Midway, was criticized by some historians for being overcautious, but he won two of the Pacific War's most important carrier battles. He retired after the war and died in 1973 at age 87. As the years passed, the number of Midway veterans dwindled. Each year, fewer survivors attended the annual June 4th commemorations. By the 2000s, most were in their 80s and 90s. By the 2010s, only a handful remained. By the 2020s, virtually all were gone. The last survivors of the Battle of Midway have now passed. The men who fought that battle are history. But their story endures. The Battle of Midway was decided in 5 minutes, from 10:22 a.m. to 10:27 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, when American dive bombers struck 3 Japanese carriers. Those 5 minutes changed the course of World War II and altered the history of the 20th century. Before those 5 minutes, Japan dominated the Pacific. After those 5 minutes, Japan was on the defensive for the rest of the war. Before those 5 minutes, American morale was shattered by 6 months of defeat. After those 5 minutes, Americans believed victory was possible. Before those 5 minutes, Japan's naval aviation was supreme. After those 5 minutes, American naval aviation would dominate the Pacific for the rest of the war. The battle demonstrated truths that remain relevant today. Intelligence matters. Courage matters. Industrial capacity matters. Bold leadership matters. Flexibility matters. The side that combines these advantages wins. But most importantly, Midway demonstrated that individuals matter. The codebreakers who broke Japanese codes, the admirals who made bold decisions, the pilots who pressed attacks through impossible odds, the sailors who fought to save their ships. These individuals, through their skill, courage, and sacrifice, changed history. 307 Americans gave their lives at Midway. Each one deserves to be remembered. Each one contributed to the victory. Each one helped change the course of the war. The Torpedo Squadron pilots who died in their attacks drew Japanese fighters away from altitude, allowing the dive bombers to strike unimpeded. Their sacrifice was not in vain. They made the 5 minutes possible. The dive bomber pilots who struck the Japanese carriers executed their attacks with precision and courage, turning the tide of the Pacific War in 5 minutes of combat. The sailors who fought fires, who manned guns, who kept the carriers operational, they made victory possible. And the intelligence officers who gave America advance warning of the Japanese attack, they made the entire battle possible. On June 4th, 1942, at a small atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, American forces turned the tide of the war. They proved that courage, intelligence, and determination could overcome numerical superiority and initial defeat. They proved that America, though wounded at Pearl Harbor, was not beaten. They proved that the sleeping giant, once awakened, was unstoppable. The Battle of Midway was the turning point, the moment when inevitable Japanese victory became inevitable American victory. The moment when the Pacific War's outcome was decided, even though 3 more years of fighting remained. 5 minutes changed everything. We remember Midway. We remember the sacrifice. We remember the courage. We remember the men who gave everything so that freedom would prevail. The Battle of Midway, June 4th to 7th, 1942. 4 Japanese carriers sunk. 1 American carrier lost. 307 American lives given. The turning point of the Pacific War. The battle that decided World War II in the Pacific. We remember.